Milestones. So we talked about that a little earlier, and we've got this nice picture of a milestone. But from a project standpoint, what I mean by that are just critical stops along the way that you're going to hit working towards your goal. And typically, for research settings in particular, although I think this is also true in a lot of projects, you're not going to know what these things are not going to be boilerplate things that you can download from a template and know. It comes to your research team and your collaborators getting together and determining, okay, what are those things? What are those points that we're going to have information that we can either make key decisions about moving forward, or we can produce something that we believe is going to be representative of whatever it is we're going to achieve. We're going to hit the end of a study. We'll be able to review data. We are going to gather a lot of information that we're going to use to determine some prototypes. Let's review that information. It's going to shift depending on what you're doing, and so that's where having that conversation around what do you know, what do you need to understand, and then considering how much in what you need to do to get that information will help you identify what these milestones are and eventually where they can happen. Objectives are those action items that you'll do to achieve those milestones. So, you know, running a certain study, gathering information, scheduling a meeting with a decision maker to get their input on what they expect. All of those things can be objectives that you would complete along the way towards achieving that milestone of saying, we now understand what design elements we need to have present in this type of a device, or we now understand what this study needs to look like. And now we can move to the next stage of executing it. You want to make sure that any objectives are what we call SMART. So we get into the space of just being specific, measurable. That's definitely true in research settings. You want to make sure that you've got some kind of alignment to what that overall goal is. That they're realistic, again, similar to our project scope, that what you're actually trying to achieve in the objective is probably a subset of that and realistic to what everyone has, and time-bound as well to fit within your project. So how do you determine the order and sequencing of these objectives? Well, you know, milestones are planned points along the way based on what your understanding of the work is and how much time is going to need to happen, but they kind of usually, if they're good, they're rolling up multiple activities or objectives that happen in parallel to get you to certain points where you have enough information that you can determine, you know, we feel we're moving in the right direction, or we need to make an adjustment to course, or maybe this direction isn't going to be promising. I like to think of them as being points that are focused around closing knowledge gaps. So you can use them to adjust your forecast on the project completion. You can modify your path, or you can determine it might take you less time to achieve something than you thought. But they should be designed around answering a key question that's relevant to helping you ensure that you're making progress towards your goal. Good plans, when you're thinking about the work that needs to go into reaching those milestones, you really want to think about, when you're defining those objectives and getting time-bound, consider worst case scenarios and really think about that. You'll never come up with everything that can go wrong, but you can definitely think about, you know, I think when we plan, we tend to focus on the optimistic. We tend to think, yeah, that typically takes me about a week. You know, and you want to really try to think about all of the times that something has happened, or pick the brain of your teammates and say, you know, well, does that feel right to you? Have you done this before? And use that information to help you consider what are some worst case scenarios so that you build in a little bit of cushion in. And cushion maybe isn't the best word, but I like to think of it as just being a bit more realistic, so you don't immediately potentially run into a scheduling or planning, you know, issue right out the gate, that you've considered what the potential range of time something could take is. So if you run into something like that earlier, that you can have some space to absorb that, and also that you've set your expectations with anyone who's tracking the outcome of your project appropriately, so they don't immediately potentially get a perception of, well, now you're out of scope, now it's going to take you longer, and that's maybe going to potentially cause me to question and have less confidence that you're going to continue to stay there. So it's definitely something to consider. And these milestones over time really, when you plan for those worst case scenarios, it gives you a little bit more space, especially in the research setting, to adjust for all of the unpredictable things that will happen. If there's one thing I can predict, it's that unpredictable things will definitely happen and they will throw off your plans. That's the one thing I know 100% will definitely happen. So that's another reason to have that space in there. It could be as simple as thinking about, I've been working through this with one team that I'm working with right now as a part of B-BIC, where we thought through, like, what's the minimum number of experiments that we want to try to achieve? How long do they take? Can we think of, like, how much time it might take us to run 3 times that? Just in case we run into some kind of sourcing issue in getting things. Testing takes longer because we have to submit some testing to a central lab. So as much as the normal turnaround time should be 2 weeks, hey, we're submitting in the holidays, isn't it possible we might see a month? And just try to bring those elements in so that you can get at something that has enough space to absorb those kinds of situations. And then the final thing related to milestones is they're always going to be tied to something that I would call a deliverable. It's another form of a noun, and that would be something you would show to the stakeholders or the decision makers that is evidence that you've done the work and you've achieved what you said you were going to achieve. So, for instance, in the case of milestone of gathering information from a variety of experts, you would have some kind of a matrix or some kind of a report or interview recordings, something along that line. Anything like that would definitely be something you could then use to say, and here's the result of our work. It could be, in the case of producing some type of a prototype, it would be the prototype itself. It could be test results, experiment results, but just something tangible that you can then point to show that you've completed what your goal was for that milestone. So have you met a milestone? And this can be a little trickier, I think, than it's sometimes considered at the beginning of a project. But making sure that you've got alignment on how you're going to show that you meet milestones is also very key, both in the beginning of your project as well as throughout the execution of it. So you want to be sure that for each milestone that you identify, you want to define what a successful completion is. You want to make sure that you've got clear ways of looking at the objectives leading into that milestone, the work that you're doing, and being able to judge, like, did this achieve my goal? Yes, no. But also capture a how or a why that's true. Usually just showing something and saying, the work speaks for itself, that's pretty rare to be able to say that. And sometimes it can appear that from a technical standpoint you've achieved your goal, but there can be different scientific opinions on things. And if you haven't spent the time talking with your stakeholders, your decision makers, or even your team around what the expectation is of the level of scientific data that you needed to stand behind showing you completed that milestone, I've definitely seen it happen where you run into having a review and the technical lead is presenting the data and someone else at the table says, I understand where you're coming from, but I just don't agree that study shows what you say it shows. So, and I'm sure you've probably seen those kinds of conversations come up in different meetings when people present results on podium. And in the case of specifically moving a project forward, it's just, you want to try to vet those opportunities as much as you can, have those conversations with the people that are going to be really critical to supporting your work moving forward, and get their input on what those expectations are so that you can try to be prepared, build that in to the definition of achieving your milestone ahead of time and be ready to show it back. You'll never predict every question that people will ask, and the work often reveals things that you don't expect along the way that necessitate further conversation. And so if you're seeing those things even before you reach that milestone, it's an opportunity to have another conversation. But it's important to continue to just be clear on, how do you define success, yes, no, as well as the how, and be ready to describe how once you've reached it. Does the entire team agree the milestone has been reached? That can be tricky as well for the same kind of reasons. And, so what are the things you want to do to reach that team alignment? I think it gets back to just having ongoing conversation and good communication as you're doing the work, following the progress, and making sure that everyone understands how it's being executed, what's being learned, and whether that information, as you learn it, changes anything around anyone's perception of what the goal should be. So this is where communication can be very important, but starting from a place of having a definition is going to always help you at least have some place that you can go back to and bring the whole team back to and say, okay, well, this is what we had agreed to at the beginning. Where are we now?